is cjhoyle. In this video I'm going to demonstrate how I built this mini Cajon drum. I built this as a gift to give to my nephew, who's 10 months old, but it's actually turned out to be a very playable instrument for people of all ages. It has a laminated wood frame with two very thin plywood panels. One of them has a snare behind it, and the other one doesn't. If you tap towards the middle, you get a nice low-pitched thud sound. As you move gradually away from the middle towards the outside, you get a progressively higher pitched sound. I've also varied the tension of these screws so that different parts in the rim make different sounds. If you combine all those sounds with the snare sound that you get when you flip it over, this proves to be quite a versatile percussion instrument. Since this was built for a young child, the two main design criteria were safety and durability. To ensure that it's safe for a child, there are no sharp edges and there aren't any holes that small fingers or hands could get stuck inside of. It was also built sturdy to ensure that it can hold up to being dropped or stepped on. It's got a smooth glossy finish to make it more resistant to getting wet and also easier to keep clean. Anyway, let me show you how I built it. I started by creating a small plywood template which forms 1/4 of the shape of the rim. I traced this template 16 times onto some reclaimed pine boards, nesting them together as close as I could, but also avoiding any big knots. I then cut out the rough shape of each piece on my small bandsaw. Getting the pieces to perfectly match the curves of the template wasn't essential at this stage. However, the edges where the pieces will meet need to be pretty accurate, so I used my strip sander to sand them right to the line. The pieces will be assembled like this, and they'll be held together entirely with glue. I used a plywood circle that I saved from a previous project to help me glue together the first layer. I applied glue to the ends of each segment and clamped them in place. To ensure the pieces don't get stuck to the plywood, it's been covered with strips of packing tape. Later that evening I removed the clamps, and as you can see it's holding together nicely. I then applied glue to the upper surface as well as the 4 pieces that will form the second layer. I glued the second layer with the joints between the pieces staggered from the first layer. Just like you'd see on a brick wall, this makes the structure very strong, and I like the appearance of it. The next morning I removed the clamps and quickly went over both sides with my power sander. I then repeated the same steps to glue on the third layer. The fourth layer was also much the same, except I didn't bother using the plywood circle when putting the clamps on. After the glue was dry, I took the whole piece over to the bandsaw and trimmed off any high spots that were overhanging. I then followed it up by doing the same on the strip sander. After the sanding, all the edges looked nice and flush. The inside of this instrument will never be seen, but I wanted to do something similar to it because I figure a smooth surface will give a better echo than a rough one. I used a homemade sanding spindle on my drill press to do this, which worked pretty well. Before moving on, I went over the outside of the instrument again, this time with my power sander. Now it's time to work on the 2 striking surfaces, or tapas, as they're known on a cajon. I had some 3/16" plywood left over from another project which I thought would work, so I traced the shape of the circle onto it and cut it out on the bandsaw. After a quick test using clamps to hold it on, I quickly determined that this material was too thick to work properly, so I did some research. According to most sources I found online, they recommend using plywood that's between 2 or 3 millimeters thick for building a cajon. It's harder than you might expect to find plywood this thin, but I managed to find an art store that's pretty close to me that sells 1/8" plywood and 1/16" plywood. Even though 1/16" is thinner than what is recommended, I decided to go with that thickness since this instrument is a lot smaller than a standard cajon. After cutting out a circle from this thin, delicate material, I was happy with the sound that it was making when I repeated the same test with some clamps holding it in place. Using a compass, I divided the circle into 6 equal parts and marked the positions for drilling the holes for the screws. I used my drill press to transfer these holes onto the rim and then drilled the holes to full depth. I want the screws to sit flush with the surface, so I added countersinks to all the holes. Since the plywood is so thin, the countersinks need to go right through into the wood below. With those screws in place, I got to hear my first glimpse of how the instrument will sound. For adding the snare sound to one of the two sides, I bought a set of snare wires from a local music store and cut it in half. I decided to try bending the wires to make it easier to mount inside. I wasn't sure if this is going to work, but I decided to try it since I'd be able to use the other half that I cut off if it didn't. I used the right angle attachment on my Dremel tool to drill the mounting holes on the inside of the instrument. The idea with this mounting method is that I'll be able to adjust the pressure of the snare by tightening or loosening the screws. Here's my first preview of how the snare sounds. After cutting out and drilling the holes for the other tapa, I mounted each of them on the instrument and took them over to the bandsaw to trim off most of the overhangs. I finished the job with a power sander, making the tapas flush with the sides and also rounding over the edges. The final step was to apply varnish to the bare wood, which I did by disassembling everything. For extra protection against moisture, I applied it to the inside of the instrument too. I used water-based Varathane wood finish and followed all the usual steps on the can. So after reassembling everything, the project was now complete. So I'm really happy with how this instrument turned out, and I'm very excited to give this to my nephew. If you'd like to hear more of this instrument being played, I provided a link in the description below to a song that I recorded for my other YouTube channel, cjhoyle Music, where I recorded this instrument along with my homemade ukulele. Anyway, if you end up building something like this, I'd love to hear about it in the comment section below, and thanks for watching.